In Game of Thrones, the show often focused on the adult characters. However, it did have plotlines pertaining to the character development of the younger individuals in the story. House of the Dragon seems to be taking a cue from its predecessor in that regard. This past episode on Sunday, which was episode 8, focused on Viserys quite a bit. He was kind of the main star of the show, and it was his last chance to shine, and I'm glad that he did. However, it did have a number of scenes introducing the new, younger characters. We've seen these characters as children before, but this was our first chance to see the adult actors and see the people that they've grown into, both literally and figuratively. And I thought that it would be interesting to examine two of them in particular. Those being Jacaerys Velaryon, son of Rhaenyra, and Aegon Targaryen, son of Alicent. Not Rhaenyra's son, Aegon, who is a baby. But yeah, I thought that these two are pretty interesting in what we've learned about them this episode, and I think they have very interesting parallels to characters we've seen in Game of Thrones, particularly Robb Stark and Joffrey Lannister/Baratheon, depending on which name you'd like to go with. So yeah, we're going to jump into an explanation of what these parallels are and just dive into the characters as a whole, get into what makes them tick and what seems to motivate them. If you enjoy this, please consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate that, and I love making videos about House of the Dragon. And yeah, let's dive into things. Both of these characters have scenes wholly devoted to their introduction and establishing their characters. Jacaerys was the first to have one, and we see him on Dragonstone studying his old Valyrian. He's not quite getting it very well initially, which makes sense. At least when I've learned languages, it's been quite tough. This could also speak to his heritage, in that he is half strong and only half Targaryen, so it could speak to him perhaps not being as naturally gifted in Valyrian things as he maybe should be if he were half Valyrian. But I do think it shows his work ethic, his drive, and his need to kind of get things done and do things the right way. It is the right thing for the king to know the old language, to know High Valyrian, so he is going to do that. He knows the duty that he has to assume, and he is going to take full responsibility for that duty. Furthermore, later that evening, when we get into the dinner scene, which we'll talk about again with Aegon, we see Jacaerys acting in a very honorable manner. He both doesn't initially rise to Aegon's taunts and attempts to make his cousin, Helena, feel better. I think cousin. An aunt, sorry. She is his aunt. The family tree is a tad confusing at this point, as I'm sure you are aware. But yeah, I think he treats her pretty nicely, and there's a very nice image of the two of them dancing, what might have been, and Viserys kind of sees that for what it is, as this final fleeting happy moment in the brief peace that exists here in this calm before the storm. But it shows that Jacaerys does pretty much have a good heart, I think. I think he's overall a good person, though I don't think he's entirely the same as Robb Stark, who's the main character that I think he parallels in Game of Thrones. Robb Stark and Jacaerys Velaryon are both young men attempting to step into leadership positions or prepare for leadership positions that they may not necessarily be entirely ready for. They both have great capabilities, and their main driving force seems to be their honor in both cases and the sense of duty they have both to those they love and to this job that they are going to fill. However, they both seem to have their own flaws. As we saw with Robb, he tends to be a bit short-sighted, especially when considering things like his marriage pact to the Freys. Whereas Jacaerys hasn't really revealed much of his flaws yet, though I think we see a little bit of them in the dinner scene I mentioned before. He's a bit quick-tempered, particularly when the potential subject of his parenthood is brought up. He's very touchy about that, and understandably so, but this is kind of something that tends to set him off and dip into the less honorable side of his character. It is worth noting that he is not entirely a parallel with Robb Stark. He also has shades of Joffrey in him, as he is someone who is going to be king, who is not who he says he is, or who people think he is. He's half strong rather than half Velaryon. This is not as big of a deal as it is with Joffrey, particularly because while this is still bad being illegitimate, the important part of his bloodline is legitimate. The part that gives him the royal authority, the Targaryen portion, is certain and is reinforced because Rhaenyra is his mother. Despite the fact that Harwin Strong is his father, he still could have a claim to the throne through his mother, particularly were he to be legitimized. I will say that him claiming to be a bastard and having that essentially legitimized would be a traitorous kind of stain on Rhaenyra's claim and likely result in her not taking the throne at all, which is why that is not the way things are going to go. This comparison of Jacaerys to Robb Stark does bring up another parallel, that being to Robb's brother, Jon Snow. Or not brother, so to speak, but I don't want to spoil Game of Thrones in case people haven't seen it. But overall, I think that both of them, especially in the early seasons of Game of Thrones, are very sensitive about the topic of their parentage and kind of the way that people throw it in their faces, which is quite interesting, could be informative as to how Jacaerys will develop into the future. I am quite happy with Jacaerys as a character. I was actually talking with my dad earlier this week, who's also been watching House of the Dragon, and said the one gripe that he had was that there's not really anybody to root for. Nobody's really a good person all around, which is entirely fair with the batch of characters we've had. However, I do think that Jacaerys is pretty much the one good man in this group. He's a fairly well-rounded character and honorable to a fault, and I really enjoy that, and I think that that is a good change of pace from the past 7 episodes. It's nice to have him around now. Moving on to the exact opposite end of the honorability spectrum, we have Aegon Targaryen, son of Viserys and Alicent, and firstborn son overall of Viserys. So the thought is that he will have some claim to the throne, at least according to Alicent and according to Otto. The main parallel I've seen people make, at least online, is between Aegon and Joffrey, and I can see that to a degree. Both of them seem to be somewhat sadistic and generally just kind of twisted in general, and both look not dissimilar, both being blonde and having similar auras of entitlement and nobility. However, I think there's a key difference between Joffrey and Aegon. In Game of Thrones, Joffrey always loved power. He wanted to be the king, he wanted to exert that control over those around him, and he wanted the absolute authority that came with it. On the contrary, Aegon is pretty much the exact opposite. His core motivation throughout what we saw of him in his younger days was not wanting the responsibility that came with this station. Kind of like a late-game Jon Snow there. I don't want it, and all that. Though Lucerys was the one who said that exact line in episode 7. Aegon does not want this power. He just wants to be left alone to do his own weird and evil thing, which is quite different when compared to Joffrey. I think that really shows a fair bit of divergence between the two characters, and I think is a very interesting point of contrast, particularly given the fact that Joffrey had power and a lot of people didn't want him to have power, whereas Aegon is pretty much the exact opposite foil mirror to that, where he doesn't want power but is having it thrust upon him, at least as it seems in the promo for episode 9. And if episode 9 goes the way I think it will, and the way it looks as though it will based on the promo, Aegon may have his own parallel to Robb Stark. It seems as though both may be assuming a leadership role following the death of their father and urged on by their mother in order to seize some form of justice or protection from an encroaching force. However, in Robb's case, it was entirely justified, as Ned is unjustly executed by King Joffrey, whereas Aegon is being guided by Alicent, who is mistaken in hearing Viserys' final words, and Otto, who is just kind of grabbing for power however he can. I also really liked the interactions between Jace and Aegon in episode 8. I thought they were really informative and interesting to see how the eldest sons of both of these marriages have fared growing up. You could really tell that Jace was raised in a loving home, whereas Aegon was kind of neglected by his parents to a degree. He was a means to an end for Alicent and Otto, and pretty much nothing more. Though a few times we see them interact on screen, Alicent is usually berating Aegon, though in this episode very much for good reason, as he is doing some very evil things that I will not get into. However, you can really see how this manifests in their characters and in their treatment of Helaena, who's Aegon's wife. Jacaerys dances with her and seems to enjoy spending time with her, laughing with her, whereas Aegon sees the relationship as purely an obligation and seems to outright dislike her or ignore her, according to what Helaena said in her speech. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting parallel, and it is cool to see the two eldest sons interacting like this when we have had some interaction between Lucerys and Aemond being the second sons throughout this episode as well. Overall, I am quite excited to see where both of these characters go in the future. I think they both have a lot of interesting potential to develop into heroes and villains with Jace and Aegon respectively, and I'm quite excited to see how that manifests, particularly in the upcoming episodes of both this season and next season, as they're both likely to be quite important in the future events of the series. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, comment, let me know which one you prefer out of Aegon or Jace. I think I know which will be more preferred, but I've been surprised before. Let me know what other kind of content you'd like to see me make, other kinds of House of the Dragon videos, or other topics you'd like to see me cover. I do have a few more in the works that I'm excited to share with you all, and yeah, thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a nice day.
You got it.